Okay, so today you're going to do something called a French seam. This is what it looks like from the back side of it, the wrong side. From the front, it looks just like a regular seam. Okay, basically the way this is a seam finish, you don't see any raw seam edges there. Okay. Okay, this is also a really good seam for lace or see-through fabric. So here I have a piece of lace. Okay, there is my seam right there. Okay, the great thing about this is you don't see just the raw edges of your seam. Okay, so if you didn't use this kind of seam on a piece of fabric that was see-through, it would look a little tacky. Okay, so this is the French seam, and there it is again. Okay, for the French seam, you will need two pieces of fabrics for your sample, pins, and of course some shears and your sewing machine. So we're going to start with some fabric that has an obvious right side and wrong side to it. So I'm using this little plaid fabric. The brighter side is the right side. The wrong side is the dull side that's not as bright and colorful. So anytime you do a French seam, you really have to think about what you're doing, because you're going to start this seam out with wrong sides together. Okay, so if you were using this seam for a skirt, you'd want to make sure your wrong sides were together. So in this case, I've got my two fabrics, my wrong sides, I'm putting those together. Okay, usually you do right sides. For this, you do wrong sides together. And I'm going to pin my wrong sides together along one side. Okay, pin that. I'm going to pin down here at the bottom. So that should be enough for that. So, wrong sides together, and what I'm going to do for this particular seam is I'm going to actually sew it with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, or a 1/4 inch seam allowance, which on our machines are the outside edge of the presser foot. So that's how I'm going to make this seam here. Okay, so taking it to the machine. Okay, again, like I said, you're going to line it up to the outside edge of the presser foot. So that's 1/4 of an inch, or 1/4 of an inch. I'm going to go ahead and take out my first pin, turn the machine on. In this case, I'm just using different color thread. Okay, make sure you have it lined up well. You're going to start your seam, back stitch. Okay, and then I'm going to sew down the rest of the seam. And then when I come back, it will be all sewn. Okay, so I have stitched my two fabrics together with the wrong sides together. There's the wrong sides together, and there's my right sides. Okay, so I got a little thread kind of hooked in there. So what you're going to do from here is you're actually going to trim the rest of that seam. I know it's a very small seam to begin with. You're going to trim it really close to your stitching. Okay, so I'm trimming it really, really close to my stitching here. Okay, so now you can see I've got very small little bit of seam allowance left. Kind of got a little far away from that one. Okay. All right, so it's a very tiny seam allowance at this point. What I'm going to do from here, I'm going to go to the iron, press this side down, then press the other side down. So I'm going to head to the iron next, and I'll show you what I'm doing from there. Okay, so I'm at the ironing board. I've got my little sample here. Here is my seam. Okay, so my right sides are up. My seam is right there. I've trimmed my seam. Now I'm going to come and kind of flatten this out, and I'm going to just iron that tiny little piece of seam allowance down to one side. It does not matter which side you iron it down to, as long as it is flat. Okay, so now let's see if I can get it in front of the camera. You see it's kind of a flat seam allowance. Now what you're going to do is fold that with the two right sides together. Okay, there's that seam you just made and pressed. So basically I'm folding it on that seam Okay, I'm going to lay it flat and I'm going to go back over that and iron it. Okay, make sure you give it a good press. So here's what it looks like now. Okay, so if you look on the inside, my seam allowance that I just sewed is on the inside. I flipped it the other way around, fold it in half, and I have that seam all enveloped in there. Okay, you've got one more step after this. Okay, so there's my fabric. Now my two right sides are together. That seam is in the fold there. I'm going to come back. I'm actually going to stitch again. Okay, so I'm going to line it up at the top here. I'm lining it up to the outside edge of my presser foot again. Okay, and then I'm going to sew down the same seam, basically. So you're basically sewing the same seam twice. But what this does is it encases your old seam into the inside of a seam here. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and do a little stitch forward, do a back stitch, and then forward again. Okay, so I'm just keeping that lined up to the outside edge of the presser foot. I think I'm actually a little bit over there. I want to get technical on me. Okay, make sure you back stitch when you finish that. Okay, so let me show you the magic of the French seam. Okay, so I sewed that there, and now when you open it up, you have a pretty, front-facing fabric there, and then your seam, your raw edge, is encased within this other seam here. Okay, so then you've got this, and then you just press it to one side. So the great thing about this is if you're using like a sheer fabric or a lace, something like that, this is the kind of seam you're going to want to use it. And again, it's called the French seam.